My name is Jacob Summer, and my belief in the supernatural is all but non-existent these days. If I'm being honest, it wasn't always like this. Prior to January 3rd, 2011, I was like most people, completely skeptical and with almost no belief in demons, ghosts, magic, and the things that go bump at night. But best believe, I have no doubts, and I can tell you certainly that there are indeed supernatural beings among us. It all started when I and my wife decided we needed some time away to vacation and spend some quality time together. We had just gotten married earlier that year and decided a getaway trip to celebrate the new year wasn't a bad idea. We both agreed not to travel to a famous city or somewhere we'd get distracted, as we wanted a quiet place where we could enjoy nature and feel close to each other. We eventually settled on a small town called Vik in Iceland. It seemed perfect, as it had a very low population and the landscapes were beautiful. The only problem was finding a hotel we could stay at. I looked around on Google for a while and eventually found a vacation rental. My wife and I were a bit skeptical at first, as we had never actually stayed in a rental home before. But we decided it was a better option than staying in a hotel out of town and booked it. My wife and I celebrated Christmas and New Year's Eve with friends and family before saying goodbye and traveling on the 1st of January 2011. There wasn't a direct flight to Vik, so we had to land in a nearby town called Reykjavik and get a bus to Vik. Finding the bus station wasn't a problem, and the bus driver helped us with our luggage before asking where we were headed. "So, where am I taking the lovely couple today?" "A town called Vik," I replied. "Vik is an odd choice for a honeymoon," he said as he started the bus. I laughed and responded with, "Well, it's not our honeymoon. We're just looking to get away." We drove for about 30 minutes before getting to Vik. At first glance, the difference between Vik and Reykjavik wasn't that much, but as we drove deeper in, I couldn't help but feel like this town had a completely eerie feel, like it was apart from the rest of the world. The driver stopped at the station before saying, "We're here." We were the only ones in the bus, so I figured he wouldn't mind taking us to the rental instead of the station. "Hey man, we really don't know how we're going to get there, so could you take us to our rental?" I continued with, "That is, if you won't mind, of course." He replied with, "Sure. Which one is it?" I took out my phone and pulled up the photo before showing it to him. His facial expressions immediately changed, and I could tell he had no intention of taking me there. He didn't say anything for a while, then eventually took out his phone and called someone. They spoke in Icelandic, so I had no clue what they were saying, but I could tell it wasn't a pleasant conversation. We waited for about 5 minutes and another car came. The driver still hadn't said anything. He simply transferred our luggage into the next car, told us to get off, and left. The new driver didn't know any English, but we figured he'd be taking us to our rental, so we got in. My wife had been awfully quiet since we landed, so I asked, "Hey babe, are you okay?" She didn't respond. "Babe?" I said, getting her attention. She then replied, "Yeah, I'm fine. I just don't feel so good." We eventually arrived at the house, and the first thing I noticed was it was much bigger in person. For the price we got it at, I had expected something much smaller, but I wasn't complaining. The driver stopped the car, and I removed our luggage. I figured I was supposed to pay him, but wasn't sure as he had been completely still since we arrived, simply staring at nothing. When I was done, I decided to pay and let him know he could leave. "All done, sir. How much do I owe you?" The driver still didn't move, and I decided to check if he was okay. But as I reached out to tap him, he immediately grabbed my hand, looking me straight in the eyes. The situation was extremely creepy, as his grip was painfully tight, and the look in his eyes was frightening. I didn't know if I had done something wrong, but before I could say anything, he simply said, "Believe," and then let me go. I wasn't sure if I still had to pay him, but he started his car and left. The feeling I got from looking into his eyes wasn't a good one. The whole atmosphere felt different. I stood there thinking about it for a while before my wife eventually said, "Hey, I've been waiting for you. Are you going to stand there all day?" I laughed and said, "I'll be right there." But before going in, I decided to find out what it was the driver said, so I took out Google Translate and repeated what he said the best I could. My heart sank as I realized what the word meant. Cursed. The first night at the rental was seemingly perfect, but little did I know that things were about to change the very next day. The next morning, first thing I noticed was that April had moved from our bed last night to another room in the house. I asked her about it casually, but she said she thought I had carried her to the other room and wasn't very happy about that. I decided it was better to let her believe this, as telling her any different may frighten her and ruin the vacation. I also noticed strange little things happening in the house that day. For starters, after taking a shower, I realized I had massive scratches on my chest and back. I could have sworn I didn't have them when I woke up, but I simply applied a cream and went to spend time with April. The next strange thing happened later on in the day. April had gone out to take some pictures for her Instagram not too far from the house, and I was using the time to catch up on some business. But then, no matter how crazy this sounds, I could have sworn I saw her walk right in front of me. At first, I thought it was April playing a game of some kind, so I put down my laptop and got up to follow. But before I could go upstairs, April walked through the front door. I was obviously confused, as I knew for a fact I had just seen someone walk past me. April didn't seem to be playing a prank, and I was beginning to bother about the situation, but didn't want to worry her, as she looked like she was finally enjoying herself. I assumed I was probably just seeing things and needed rest. Later that night, about 10 p.m., April and I decided to call it a day and go to bed. Before going to bed, she looked at me and said, "Babe, is everything all right? You've been acting kind of strange." I admit, I had been a bit paranoid about all the incidents since the driver's vague message, but I still had no intention of worrying her, so I responded with, "No, I'm fine. There's nothing wrong." She looked at me almost like she could tell I was lying. "I just want you to be okay." I gave her a smile and kiss before falling asleep. At around midnight, I woke up to a very odd feeling. April was grabbing my foot and pulling at it. Now, I didn't understand why she was doing this so early in the morning, but I wasn't up for it, so I simply said, "April, it's too early. Come back to bed," and tried to go back to sleep. About 5 minutes later, April tugged at my foot again, and I simply pulled my leg back inside. 5 minutes later, I felt a hand on my foot. I tried pulling it away, but it gripped so tight, it felt like I would break a bone. I opened my eyes and was immediately flung from the bed. It was only then I realized April wasn't on our bed anymore. Whatever it was that pulled me off my bed was probably also responsible for the scratches and strange things happening in the house. Now, as you can imagine at this point, I was completely creeped out and decided to call for help. I immediately Googled the emergency number for Iceland and dialed. "Hello, please? I need help. There's someone in my house," I said. "Yes, and what's your address?" she replied. I gave the address, but what followed was silence. Then she eventually said, "Sir, I would recommend you leave the house immediately. Help is on the way, but please leave the house." I was about to inform them of my wife being missing when someone walked by my room door. I immediately dropped the phone and followed. Finally, examining what I was following, I understood why I mistook it for April earlier, as its physique was very similar to that of a woman. She was dressed in all black without any shoes on, and with every step it took, it looked like she wet the ground. I followed her all the way downstairs and couldn't help but wonder if she knew I was following, but chose to ignore me. She walked into a room and I followed, but when I stepped in, she was gone. I turned around to walk back out and immediately felt a hand grip my neck. There was nothing human about this creature. Its face was pale blue and its eyes were almost completely dark. It had marks around its neck and was missing parts of its hair, but the weirdest thing about it was that it was drenched. I tried hitting its hand to free myself, but its grip only tightened around my neck. At this point, I could barely breathe, and I could feel myself losing consciousness. That's when I heard the door being forced open. I passed out and hit the floor. I woke up in an ambulance a couple of minutes later. There were a few paramedics and police officers around me. "April!" I screamed as I looked around for her. The officers informed me that there was no one in the house, and despite my best efforts, recommended I stay away from the house that night. I eventually visited the house with officers the following day. But even then, I couldn't find my wife or anything that could help. When giving my statement, the officer didn't seem shocked in the slightest. I found that pretty bizarre, seeing as I was describing a demon to him. After some time on the case, I met with their chief, and he informed me that Vic wasn't that big a town, and if they hadn't found her by now, it wasn't a good sign. There's a story among the people of Vic regarding the house you were staying in, sir. They say a few years back there was a couple who lived in that same house. The story has different versions, but what most people believe is that the husband was very abusive to the wife and eventually killed her and drowned her body in the lake. He continued. The husband denied all the allegations and said the wife had been cheating and must have run off with her lover. Her family did not believe the story, but there was no evidence, so the case was closed quickly. Some believe her family called to the old gods because just a few days later, the husband was strangled to death in the apartment. Normally, I'd disregard the story as bullshit immediately, but after what I'd seen, I very much believed it. What does that have to do with my wife and I asked. The officer responded with, well, most believe the soul of the woman still haunts the house after that. Whenever people move in, someone ends up dying, and it's always the husband. They say, in the eyes of the spirit, all men are evil, and this is justice. He continued. So the house was bought and turned into a rental, although no one even went close to it until now. But I'm very sorry to hear about your wife, and I want you to know we'll do everything to find her. The cops didn't have any answers for why my wife disappeared, as it was the first time it was happening. My family came over to stay with me, as I had decided to stay for the following weeks until April was found. It's been 12 years now, and I haven't heard anything from or about my wife. The first years were horrible, and I spent countless days searching, but I found nothing. I can't help but wonder if the demon took my wife because she couldn't kill me. Maybe it was my fault for taking her there. Things are slowly getting better, though, and I have fewer and fewer nightmares about the demon. But I will never give up on my wife, and best believe I will never forget the days I spent in a haunted house. Hi, I'm Detective Arthur Field, and you may have heard me narrate the story about how I almost got killed by a psycho serial killer. And if you like that story, you will love the one that I am about to tell you. Now, as you know, I'm a detective. But before becoming a detective, I was a normal cop, which meant instead of investigating homicides, I did all the normal cop duties, like patrolling, attending 911 emergency calls, etc. This is an incident that happened to me when I was at my new job. I was young and eager to prove myself. Whenever any senior cop needed a hand, I was always there to help. As I was young and so full of energy, I did not mind taking the night shift. I was working in a small town anyway, so nothing much happened at night anyways. The most important part of the night shift was patrolling the town. We had an 8 p.m. shift, and the next was a 2 a.m. shift. Me and some other cops drove around the town making sure everything was all right. When I first started patrolling at night, some of the senior cops told me that there were several abandoned houses in town. Often, teenage kids partied in these houses or homeless people took shelter in them. In both scenarios, I was instructed to ask the occupants to leave the house. However, in my months of patrolling, there was one particular house on the outskirts of our town that no one ever went into. The whole town used to call it the haunted house. I drove by it every night, but nothing weird or paranormal ever happened there. I just ignored the abandoned house and went on my way. Until one morning around 3 a.m. I was just about to finish my round when I saw the front door of that house open. Considering the fact that it was old and falling apart, the door must have opened due to wind or raccoon. I decided to step out of my car, but first let the operator know that I was approaching the house to close its front door. As soon as I climbed the porch, I heard a giggle coming from upstairs. It sounded like a few toddlers were playing and laughing upstairs. This creeped me out, and all the weird story the townspeople had told me about this house came crashing back. But I was a cop, and it was my job to make sure the house was clear. So instead of just shutting the door and leaving, I grabbed my pocket flashlight, drew my gun, and started checking out the bottom floor. Hello, it's the police. Anyone in here? The giggling got louder as I checked each room one by one, and finally approached the staircase that led to the top floor. Anyone up there, please make yourself known. It's the police, I announced once again. The giggling continued, but now I could hear the footsteps of 2 or maybe 3 little kids running. Their little feet carried them from one room to another. I was scared shitless, but I had a duty to complete. And unless I do make sure with my own eyes that the house is empty, I wasn't going to leave. As I stepped onto the top floor, everything became pin-drop silent, as if nothing at all had happened here a few moments ago. My hands were shaking, and I was silently saying a prayer as I checked the top floor. There were 3 rooms and a bathroom upstairs, and each and every room was empty. No intact furniture in any of the rooms, which meant no place for hiding. As soon as I made sure there were no kids there, I just left the house. I got in my car and drove off. I told all the cops what happened, but no one took me seriously. The next day, the house looked fine, with no open doors or giggling kids. The other cops and some townspeople loved to give me shit about that incident. One amongst them was Miss Tucker. She often visited the station as her husband was the sheriff. She was in her 40s, enjoyed calling me names like Pussy Car and Scared Cow after the haunted house incident. Luckily for me, I got transferred to another town soon after that. My career kept on excelling until I became a detective. However, I never got the answer to what was going on in the haunted house until recently. One of my former colleagues, a fellow cop who used to work with me in that station, reached out to me a few days ago. "Detective Field, it's Officer Rogers. How have you been?" "Rogers, so nice to hear from you after so long. I'm doing great, solving cases. What about you? Why did you call me after so long?" "Remember the haunted house? The one you had to patrol past every night?" "Yeah, how can I forget it? That was the first and the last time I was so scared on duty. What about it?" "Did you hear about what happened there?" "No, I haven't. Never looked into it once I left the town, to be honest." "Well, do you remember Miss Tucker, the sheriff's wife?" "The nosy one? Yeah, sure I do. Can't forget her as well." "So, the night when you heard the kids giggling and running, it wasn't your mind playing tricks on you, or a ghost. There were kids up there." "Wait, what? Are you serious? Because I checked all the rooms and they were empty. There was no one there. How is this even possible?" "Calm down, Field. Let me explain. So do you remember there were reports of 3 toddlers missing from our town a few days before you entered the haunted house?" "Yeah, man, I remember each case I have worked on. I remember scouting the entire sugarcane field looking for those kids." "Those kids were hidden in that house." "Rogers, I do not get what you are trying to say. I just have more and more questions." "I know that, Arthur. So, the kids were kidnapped and hidden in the house. However, the toddlers did not know they were kidnapped. They thought it was all a game. They trusted their kidnapper as the face was familiar to them. You know how kids can be." "Okay, so that explains why they were hiding from me. The kidnapper did not want me to find them, so he must have asked the kids to hide in some secret hiding spot that I couldn't find." "Yes, that's exactly what happened. Just instead of the kidnapper being a man, it was a woman." "Who was she? Who could abduct kids from their own town?" "Miss Tucker. She used to babysit all those 3 kids, so the kids trusted her completely." "Man, that's horrible. But why did she take them?" "Last year, they started a new project in town to demolish all those abandoned houses. She was opposed to it, but the mayor approved it anyways. When they tore down the haunted house, they found 3 skeletons in there. 3 kid-sized skeletons. A big investigation was launched, and it did not take much time for the detective to connect the skeletons to the missing kids case. Unfortunately for Miss Tucker, some evidence found in the house pointed toward her. They took her in for questioning, and she cracked under pressure, confessed to her crimes, and is now behind bars serving life. She took the kids to perform some sacrificial ritual in that house so she could have kids too. Everything was so unfortunate to watch. Just wanted you to know that you were right all along, and if we had investigated a bit more, we could have saved the kids. Bye. Talk to you soon." Yeah, man. Thanks for letting me know. I hung up the phone and just sat there at my desk thinking. What do you think? Was it my fault that those kids died? Should I have been a bit more brave?
It has been many months since we left. After weeks of torture and fright, we finally decided enough was enough. We packed up our things and left. Most wouldn't understand or even begin to comprehend why a young couple lacking in any kind of wealth would choose to move out of any kind of previous accommodation. But they didn't know the truth that lies within that wretched place. It all began right on the first week of us moving in. We had just finished our degrees at university, and we were searching for somewhere close by where our new jobs were to call home. It didn't take long before we came across a house far under the normal market price, so without thinking, we bought it without even looking around. The owners were already gone by the time we had arrived, so we got straight onto moving our furniture in. Without much to our name, as of yet, we moved everything in within just 2 days, and on the third, we can now call it home. We were so excited to finally have a home, and that night we went to bed brimming with excitement and energy. That's when I started seeing it. That very same night, I had woken up in what seemed to be the middle of the night. It was pitch black outside, and it wasn't that state of waking up where you can simply get up, go to the toilet, maybe just roll over to find a better sleeping position. No, this was something different. My entire body still seemed to be sleeping, and even though my eyes were fully open, I couldn't even move my face. Although I was mildly shocked by this lack of movement, I didn't necessarily feel terrified or scared. That was until I felt something watching me. Suddenly, I felt extremely uneasy, and I tried to call out to Jack, my boyfriend, but my lips stayed shut. Without much point in trying to get up or wake Jack, I managed to close my eyes, and with everything I had, drifted back to sleep. The next morning, we both still felt that rush of excitement from all the moving in, and we just sat up in bed to read for a while before breakfast. As I reached for my book, which was usually located on my bedside table directly next to me, I was surprised to see it had fallen to the floor. I could barely remember the night before, as if it were a dream, so perhaps I knocked it over in my sleep, I thought, while I picked it up from the floor. After about 20 minutes, we both felt our stomachs roaring to be fed, so we got out of bed, popped our slippers on, and headed down the stairs to the kitchen. The kitchen was mostly colored white and black, an attempt at a modern style, but the walls bore cracks and the cupboards all bent slightly off their hinges, clinging to the bearings to stay upright. Over at the sink, several patches of rust and dark stains engulfed the once gleaming metal. As disgusting as it was practically the same filth we were previously living in at our shared dorm rooms, so we didn't care and went to grab some cereal. The rest of the day felt normal after that. We finished breakfast, went to our jobs, came back, and got ready for dinner. Instantaneously, we noticed that rusty, stained sink was now completely spotless. Looking at each other with strained eyebrows, confused by its sudden cleanliness, we nervously walked over to continue washing our hands. The water rumbled in the pipes as it struggled to make its way to our waiting hands. By the time it burst out, we jolted back to see the water was brown and seemed to contain specks of muck and filth within it. Jack hastily turned the tap off and pulled the plug, hoping to drain the sewage-like liquid. As it sunk into the drain, we stared at each other, mouths wide open in disgust. Later that evening, other strange occurrences started happening around the house too. Objects were falling off the shelves regardless of the fact that all the windows were closed, so no gust of wind or drafts could be flowing through the house. The excitement still held on. We were still living in a house, bought below market price, and we could hire a plumber to deal with that rotten pipework connected to the sink. We laid there in bed, staring at the ceiling, preparing ourselves for slumber after a long day of work. After a while, I could start to hear Jack's mumbled snoring, which I giggled at before falling asleep myself.
Hungry. Hungry.
My eyelids split open after hearing a raspy voice whispering hungry almost straight into my ear. Horrified by this unnatural noise, I tried to sit up and look around, but my body was once again motionless. This time, however, my head was positioned toward the corner of the room. As my eyes returned back to focus, I spotted a mortifying figure huddled over in the corner, back to the wall, facing me, grinning. I froze in fear. My body started shaking uncontrollably from the horror of what lay before me, but I still had no control over it to escape or warn Jack. Even trying to scream wouldn't work. All that came out was a hushed murmur as that thing kept grinning at me. I couldn't make out its face either. Its dark form meant only the very highlights of its foul jaws could be seen in the darkness. I was petrified. Hours later, still staring into that grinning nightmare, the sun had finally begun to rise, and my eyes were able to rest, even just for a few hours. In the morning, I looked over to see Jack, still asleep, drooling onto his pillow. A faint smile spread across my face before I remembered the night before, exactly like last time. It felt like a dream, a state of total futility and dreadful fear. I shook Jack awake and blurted out everything I could remember, drenching the sheets with tears. I couldn't have been more scared. He took it more or less seriously enough and told me,
"Don't worry, I'll stay awake tonight, okay? Then if that thing comes again, I'll deal with it. Sound good?"
I nodded slightly, still dripping from the tears, and we once again got up to go downstairs for breakfast. As we walked into the kitchen that morning, I stopped in the doorway as I saw the book that should have been on my bedside table, which was now perched on top of the dining table. Not only was my book now moving on its own in the night, but that also wasn't all either. That sink we saw yesterday evening, which was spotless, well, it was covered in rust and dark stains again. Terror was beginning to set in. We decided it was time to do something about what was going on around the house. So, for the rest of the day, we prepared a camera directly at the sink and bought several cans of coffee so Jack would be able to stay awake that night. The smell of caffeine engulfed my nostrils as we headed back inside after returning from the shops. I longed for it, but we knew I needed to sleep to get through this. All that remained now was to wait for night to fall and that thing to return. We sat in bed for the next few hours and talked while Jack comforted me. He told me it would be alright, but as soon as we saw the sun dip below the horizon and the moon rise into the sky, we knew it was time. We climbed under the duvet, ready for the night ahead. At least that was what we thought. The hours clocked by one, and soon enough, I had fallen into a deep sleep. Jack sat awake, sipping coffee, and kept looking out the corner that I had told him about the previous night. For hours, the house lay still and silent, almost cautious to not disturb my slumber. Then, all of a sudden, it started.
Hungry. Hungry.
Just as I had done the previous 2 nights, my eyes shot open. Everything was completely void of all light. That was aside from one particularly visible patch of light on the ceiling. As my pupils darted around the room, I strained to tell Jack that it was happening. I needed him. A vast wave of relief washed over me as I felt him moving about on the other side of the bed. I was safe. Just then noticed something in the corner of the ceiling where that dim patch of light sat. There, latched onto the ceiling, was a figure of no human form, grinning down at me, its teeth sharp and twisted. The utter terror and fear gripped me and forced me into shock. My body immediately started violently shaking. My mouth foamed all while I had to lay there and watch as the figure crept towards me. On its way, it knocked over my book that I had once again put on the bedside table to read in the morning. I took my eyes off of it for just that second and it had vanished. A stroke of luck, it would seem. The noise of the book colliding with the floor also had alerted Jack next to me. I felt him crawl over and lean next to my face. It confused me a bit, until I heard it whisper, there, grinning at me, was that awful figure observing me in my struggle with such sadistic joy that my seizure stopped. And then I felt it. I burst out of bed as soon as I woke up. Jack had seen me having a seizure during the night and tried waking me up. It did nothing for a while, but eventually I came to. We dialed for an ambulance that came just minutes later. I was completely pale and barely able to walk when it arrived, and the paramedics said I was still massively in shock, and I needed to rest before they could check me over for injuries or diagnose what had happened to me. A few hours later at the hospital, after I had finally calmed down, Jack came in with several doctors who were ready to run tests on me and have me looked at. The results were returned quickly and showed I had been in a state called sleep paralysis, which was also the reason for the seizure, which was due to the shock of the things I could see while stuck in that paralyzed state. The results seemed acceptable, but when I asked why I could hear it talking, their faces dropped. They told me under strained breath that it was extremely rare for there to be any speech while in sleep paralysis, regardless of who it was from. I sat there and contemplated this. Then I told them it had been knocking over my book. Disbelief fell upon all their faces, and they decided to check me for any psychological problems, but none were found. They discussed it for a while, but simply couldn't come to any final conclusion, and so told me to take some antidepressants, and that was that. On the way home, me and Jack sat there, bewildered by the lack of acknowledgement of what had happened just last night. When we arrived home, we decided to check the camera that had been watching the sink, but we found out that it had run out of battery before the night even started. Jack said it was fully charged when he set it up. Peculiar as it was, we left it. Even to this day, even in this new house, even in this new bed,